Well, I think, there was a version really ready before Russia invaded. And I think Jake Sullivan's sort of view at the time was that what we were expecting, and of course the administration was expecting Russia's invasion of Ukraine and had warned about it, could be just an enormous geopolitical event that would have very dramatic consequences, not just for European security, but for global security.
That's the voice of Tom Wright, the Senior Director for Strategy at the National Security Council. He's today's guest on Press the Button, a Ploughshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now here are your co-hosts Tom Collina and Lauren Billett.
Thanks, Angela, and welcome back to Press the Button. We are a little over a week away from Press the Button Live Nuclear Policy in Crisis, happening at 3 p.m. Eastern Time next Wednesday, November 16th over Zoom. Guests for this event include IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi, Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, former President of Ireland Mary Robinson, and many more.
Yes, and we will be having important and timely conversations about the war in Ukraine, the future of the Iran nuclear deal, North Korea, the nuclear posture review, and lots more. So to get more information and to RSVP, please visit our website at ploughshares.org. It's going to be a great event. Hope you can join us.
Yes, it will be. And Tom, I know that you'll be there, so our guests won't want to miss that either. But Tom, what do you have for us this week on the nuclear front?
Thanks, Lauren. Lots of updates this week, lots of secret talks going on. Biden's National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, has reportedly held confidential discussions with senior Russian officials amid concerns that Russia could use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. The Wall Street Journal reported that the discussions aim to prevent escalation and keep communication channels open, but not to settle the war in Ukraine. Meanwhile, the Washington Post reports that the Biden administration is privately encouraging Ukraine to show it is willing to negotiate with Russia and drop their public refusal to engage in peace talks unless President Putin is removed from power. This appears to be more about managing public anxiety about an endless war than actually pressuring Kyiv to negotiate a ceasefire. This comes after congressional Democrats were roundly criticized for suggesting that President Biden should push for Ukraine and Russia to hold talks on ending the war. On the dirty bomb front, the UN nuclear watchdog, the International Atomic Energy Agency, announced last Thursday that no signs of undeclared nuclear activity had been detected at 3 sites in Ukraine that were inspected at Kyiv's request. Moscow has repeatedly accused Ukraine of planning to use a dirty bomb, which, as our listeners know, is a conventional weapon laced with nuclear material, but would not have a nuclear explosion. The Ukrainian government has repeatedly denied these accusations and accused Russia of launching a false flag operation to justify escalating the war. The UN findings are helpful, but not definitive, and so we should not expect them to satisfy Russia or to halt its accusations. So I think this story will go on. Finally, on China, last week leader Xi Jinping rebuked Russia's nuclear threats in Ukraine for the first time. China, a key Russian ally, warned Moscow against threatening to use nuclear weapons in the Ukraine war, a rare departure from its usual tacit support. The warning came during talks between Chinese leader and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. This will hopefully come as an important reminder to Russia that using nuclear weapons in Ukraine could alienate its most important friends, including China and India.
Thank you for that update, Tom. And what do you have for us this week on early warning?
This week on Early Warning, I sit down with Monica Montgomery with Council for Livable World, and we discuss the midterm elections and what impact they may have on military assistance to Ukraine, the overall defense budget, and on nuclear weapons.
And then Ploughshares Fund President Dr. Emma Belcher talks with Tom Wright, the Senior Director for Strategy at the National Security Council. They discuss the Biden-Harris national security strategy, Ukraine's impact on the strategy, and the U.S.'s upcoming challenges with China and Russia. It's a timely conversation, so please stay tuned.
And if you like what you hear, as always, please remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Your feedback helps us improve the show. And with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now,
Early warning.
early warning, early warning,
Early warning.
a 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Jacqueline. Midterm elections are here, and they could have a big impact on U.S. national security priorities. As listeners know, the Biden administration, with bipartisan congressional support, has been providing billions of dollars of military support to Ukraine in its war against Russia. And it's fair to say the congressional support has been crucial to Ukraine's recent successes on the battlefield. But the elections could bring winds of change. Some Republicans, such as House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, have recently signaled that they could cut funding for the war if they take control of the House. And over the past 8 months, supporters of former President Donald Trump have joined with skeptics of military intervention to challenge Republican support for the war. To help us understand what to expect, today we're joined by Monica Montgomery, the interim political director at the Council for Livable World. She wrote a recent article in Arms Control today called The U.S. Defense Budget and Russia's War on Ukraine. And it's a great read, so please check it out. Monica, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Tom. Always a pleasure.
So the war in Ukraine has become an election issue. In your view, how have the candidates positioned themselves on the war during the campaign?
So on the whole, I would not say that Ukraine has been a major issue in the 2022 midterm elections. That certainly doesn't mean that it hasn't come up. Every candidate has had to deal with questions about the war, bringing foreign policy onto the campaign trail much more than it otherwise likely would have come up. But unlike other issues like women's right to choose, the economy and inflation, violent crime and immigration, and the 2020 election and January 6th insurrection that are dominating the conversation, voter opinion is not fundamentally shifting because of candidates' positions on the war. And in some ways, that's connected to your question, to go back to it on how candidates have positioned themselves. Obviously not trying to brush over the nuances here. The overwhelming positions that candidates have taken is essentially do whatever we can to help Ukraine without risking a direct war between the United States and Russia, which we could argue is the bottled down view of the majority of Americans, and polling backs this up. On the left, we've seen a lot of framing about how this is a conflict of democracy versus autocracy, a human rights crisis, and strong support for robust military and humanitarian aid for Ukraine. On the right, we've seen a little bit more of a mixed bag. Most establishment conservative candidates take similar positions to the Democratic framing, though with a bit more hawkish rhetoric around the threat that Russia poses and how the United States should respond. But some more populist GOP candidates, as you noted, have swayed from this majority narrative, downplaying Ukraine's significance to the United States and advocating for a lighter touch or reduced aid. Most notably, perhaps, Ohio Senate Republican candidate J.D. Vance said earlier this year, quote, "I gotta be honest with you. I don't really care what happens to Ukraine," end quote, and argued that U.S. aid provided to Ukraine would be better spent on building a wall on America's southern border. One common theme across the right, which is unsurprising in an election year, placing at least part of the blame on President Biden, saying his weakness and appeasement of Russia led to the situation we are now in.
Now, in this election, of course, we could see the Senate, the House, or both flip to Republican control. First, I'd like to get your predictions on that, but we won't hold you to them. What's your sense of what's going to happen in the election?
So let me just start by saying Democrats have faced an uphill battle this cycle throughout it when looking at the national political environment, Biden's underwater approval ratings, and the historic challenge of the midterms. In the last 21 midterms held since 1934, only twice has the president's party actually gained seats in both the Senate and the House. In a handful of elections, they've gained seats in one chamber, meaning that the majority of the time, seats have been lost in both chambers. We've seen shifting winds throughout the cycle, but the general consensus right now as we approach November 8th is that Republicans currently have the momentum. Now, I won't dare get into predictions, especially as we get this close to Election Day, but personally, I will be looking for whether Democrats can hold the Senate and how large, to be honest, the Republican margin will be in the House, because that will be critical for the agenda that they pursue.
Now, if one house flips, what do you expect Congress to do on aid to Ukraine?
So when it comes to how the election and Republicans taking over control of at least one chamber will affect, I think this also remains to be seen. But in general, there is still a strong bipartisan support for robust aid for Ukraine. As you noted, last month, catching headlines, House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, who would likely be Speaker of the House, said that there will be no more, quote, blank check for Ukraine. However, he has walked back those comments some, saying that it is not that a GOP-led House wouldn't still provide funding, but rather that they won't rubber stamp White House requests. So certainly expect a lot more back and forth to develop future aid packages. It's important to note also that in the Senate, Minority Leader Mitch McConnell remains a stalwart supporter of funding for Ukraine. Going back to the candidates' positioning on the campaign trail, however, there is an emerging divide within the GOP about Ukrainian aid. So it'll be curious to watch how leadership, and especially McCarthy in the House, will navigate the party's factions on this.
And presumably, even if there is a congressional reduction in funding, Democrats and the White House would have ways of counteracting that, would they not?
Yeah, of course. I think that the White House has been clear that this is a priority that they will continue to push for. And narrow majorities in both chambers often leads to whoever is in power to having to broker deals across the aisle to push forward on their agenda. That means if Democrats are strongly unified in their support for Ukrainian aid and the White House is pushing on this, it's likely that they will continue to be able to work with some members of the Republican Party to push forward on aid for Ukraine.
And last question for you, how might the outcome of the elections impact some other major issues, such as overall defense spending and within that spending on nuclear weapons?
So as I was just saying, narrow majorities that we've seen over the past 2 years increases the power of the fringe, but it also stymies any serious policy shift as the majority has to seek uniformity in their own party or work across the aisle. Accordingly, defense spending is unlikely to change in any significant way, regardless of the outcome of the elections. Spending has been trending up across the Trump-Biden administrations, and I see no reason that trend would change no matter the outcome. The Republican control of committees could mean that bills start off at a higher top line. The same goes for nuclear weapons spending. Modernization funding is not set to peak until the 2030s, and the overwhelming majority of programs and spending will continue full steam ahead no matter who leads in Congress. Republican control, however, could lead to a more attention on and funding for controversial programs like the nuclear armed Sea-launched cruise missile, new warheads, and possibly even funding to prepare for future explosive nuclear testing. Outside of spending, however, if Republicans do take control of either lever of Congress and take over some gavels, we can expect a shift in rhetoric and agenda, with focus on issues like the quote-unquote woke military, abortion access for service members and their families, oversight investigations into withdrawal of Afghanistan, and a more aggressive focus and hawkish rhetoric on China and other adversaries.
Monica, thank you so much. Really appreciate sharing your expertise with us this morning, and best of luck in all your work.
Thank you, Tom.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline Shing, the Communications and Marketing Specialist at Ploughshares Fund. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has exposed just how close nuclear escalation and nuclear war can be. To meet the urgency of this moment, Ploughshares Fund has launched a donation match challenge to make the largest grants possible to those who are working every day to reduce and eliminate nuclear weapons. Right now, all first-time gifts will be matched dollar for dollar, and all new monthly gifts will be matched at their 12-month value. Or increase your giving and the full amount above your last gift will be matched. Go to ploughshares.org/donate today. And thanks for listening.
In October, the Biden-Harris administration released its long-awaited national security strategy. Last winter, as it became clear that Russia might invade Ukraine, the government delayed the publication of its national security strategy, which is required of every new administration. The Biden administration has now released the related National Defense Strategy, the Nuclear Posture Review, and the Missile Defense Review. According to the National Security Strategy, outcompeting China and containing Russia, as well as restoring democracy at home, will be the greatest challenges for the United States in the coming years. The report outlined China's moves towards authoritarian governance and revisionist foreign policy as the primary concern. Today, I'm delighted that we are joined by Tom Wright, the Senior Director for Strategy at the National Security Council. Tom, it's great to have you here today.
Emma, thanks so much for having me on. Really looking forward to it.
Likewise. So let's dig right in. How did Russia's invasion of Ukraine change the national security strategy? Did you have to do much rewriting, or was the original version robust enough to deal with Putin's invasion?
Well, I think, there was a version really ready before Russia invaded. And I think Jake Sullivan's sort of view at the time was that what we were expecting, and of course, the administration was expecting Russia's invasion of Ukraine and had warned about it, could be just an enormous geopolitical event that would have very dramatic consequences, not just for European security, but for global security. And there's a precedent here. In 2001, the Bush administration had a strategy that was largely finished in August. And then, of course, it was, delayed and rewritten because of 9/11 in 2015. And the second Obama term, their national security strategy had been sort of rewritten and delayed because of the rise of ISIS and in the Middle East. So it's better, I think, to get it right and to have a clear sort of geopolitical picture, at least as clear as possible. And so it was delayed at that point. Just on a personal note, too, I started in April. Obviously, my predecessor, Sasha Baker, finished in January. Rebecca Lisner was there in between. So there were some, just bureaucratically, there's some personnel shifts as well. But I think when we looked at it, we had a very strong draft. It was in very good shape. I think a lot of that remains in place. But it was also an opportunity over the following few months to really, take a look at it and refine it further. And I think that bring the core messages out even more starkly.
The report seeks to break down the division between domestic and foreign policy. According to the strategy, US strength would come from reaffirming democracy's traditions. Is this a result of former President Trump's focus on domestic issues rather than foreign policy and his attacks on democratic principles?
No, I think really it's a recognition that, especially in relation to the competition with China, that will be determined in large part by these foundational technologies and by technological innovation. It will also be determined by sort of domestic strengths and how they're applied sort of internationally. And that because of China's sort of unfair economic practices, that we can't just rely on market forces for that. And I think that's a pretty sort of bipartisan position now, that there needs to be sort of a very targeted and focused approach to industrial policy to make sure that the US and our allies and partners can gain and maintain a competitive edge, especially on those foundational technologies. And then the same sort of applies in a way to the shared challenges like climate and others, where technological innovation is incredibly important. And then there's a broader set of infrastructural issues too. So I think that's mainly the driving focus behind the breaking down of the barriers between domestic and foreign policy.
The strategy identified that the overwhelming challenge for the US in the coming years will be outcompeting China and restraining Russia. How is the US going to balance these two actors which require different approaches? Is this a struggle between democracies and autocracies?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And there's a lot there. I mean, I would say that the strategy as a whole, talks about two buckets of challenges. So strategic competition with China and with Russia on the one hand, and dealing with shared challenges on the other. And really the main sort of takeaway is the interrelation between those two, how the shared challenges affect geopolitical competition and the role that they play in geopolitical competition, and then how we need to be cognizant of a competitive environment when it comes to cooperating with others. So it really tries to be the first strategy that deals with both of these and the connection between them. But I would say that on the geopolitical side, we say, I mean, as you mentioned at the beginning, we have had this major war at the heart of Europe, a war that I think is, by historical measures, pretty bad in terms of the number of casualties and the damage done. The consequences geopolitically, I think, could be fairly profound. And it's obviously been a major focus of the administration's policy. We wanted this document to reflect the president's worldview, of course. And so we deal with that quite a bit in the document. But we also acknowledge that China is still the most consequential geopolitical challenge that we face, and that no other country has the intent and increasingly the capability to sort of challenge the international order as a whole. And so that, I think, remains sort of the priority. But of course, we are sort of leaning in very strongly to the Russia challenge as well. I think, as you note, they are sort of different, but they are related in ways that you mentioned, including sort of the fact that both are sort of highly personalized autocracies. Both, I think, have a relatively shared vision of what they worry about in the world, which is sort of the success of international classical liberalism, for want of a better term, and to make the world safe for their brand of autocracy. But then there are significant differences too. And so as we look at it, the domestic investments and really preparing for this prolonged competition that's primarily about China. Russia, I think, poses this immediate threat to the security order in Europe and is a destabilizing actor internationally, but they lack those across the spectrum capabilities that the PRC has.
So let's dig in a little more on China. In what ways is the US addressing China, and how can we avoid war over Taiwan?
I think we talk about three different sort of lines of effort in the strategy. The first is to investing in strengths at home, and that includes these domestic investments in foundational technologies. It includes strengthening our democracy. The second line of effort is building the strongest possible coalition internationally. And there we do talk about this autocracy democracy frame, which is incredibly important to the president. But we sort of point out that really it's about a layering of autocracy with the revisionist foreign policy and certain types of destabilizing behaviors. And so there are plenty of countries that don't have democratic institutions or aren't democracies that are not sort of behaving in that way. Many countries come to mind, such as Vietnam, Singapore, and others. And those are sort of natural partners of the US as we're working toward a shared vision for the world. So that's sort of the second line of effort. And the third is strengthening and modernizing the military for an era of strategic competition. There's lots of sort of sub pieces to that, including on enhancing deterrence. The language in Taiwan, I think, is very similar, identical, in fact, to the language we've used previously, so no major change there. But I think it is about sort of instituting a competitive mindset and looking at ways in which we can be in a better position, but also pushing back against the sort of assertive and destabilizing behaviors that we sometimes see from Beijing.
So you mentioned that the stance toward Taiwan hasn't changed. How can we make sure we can avoid war over Taiwan?
Yeah, well, I think we have a position on Taiwan that's longstanding. I think we saw over the course of August, following the speaker's visit to Taiwan, the PRC undertake certain actions that seem to have the intent of changing the status quo. We believe that that was ill-advised. I made it clear at the time, I think, that it would not change. Our behavior, our position remains the same, which is opposed sort of to the use of force to change the equilibrium or the status quo over Taiwan. So I would say that I think, obviously, we will continue to support Taiwan. We will help Taiwan defend itself. We are not in favor of independence for Taiwan. We are very much in favor of a peaceful way of approaching this. So I think that's our position. Hopefully this strategy will put us in a better position, continuing a better position over time to deal with this challenge.
As a result of Putin's repeated threats of nuclear use in Ukraine, the situation's really dangerous. How is the US going to support Ukraine but not provoke an escalation of the war by Russia?
It is something we're worried about. Russian rhetoric, including Putin's speech, I think about a month ago, are quite sort of unnerving in that regard. And we have, I think now it's a matter of public record that we've been sending sort of deterrent messages to Russia. We said the National Security Advisor has said publicly that this would entail, I think he said, catastrophic consequences, but we've also used other terms if they were to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And so to us, I think this will be a world-changing event, hugely destabilizing and dangerous event, and completely unnecessary. So on the one hand, I think are sending a strong deterrent sort of message to Russia that they should not do this. It would not benefit them. We cannot allow a situation where a country can use nuclear weapons and gain a military advantage, because if that is the case, then I think we're in a wholly different world. On the other hand, I think we're also making it clear, that this war, is not existential for Russia. Like, we do not seek regime change in Russia. We are not trying to use this war to destroy the Russian state or to weaken the Russian state. All we want is a free and independent Ukraine with the ability to defend itself and deter against future attack. And so that's what we seek. And that's very much in the power of Russia to facilitate if they were to end this war and withdraw from the territory that they have occupied. So President Zelensky has said at different points that Russia got to February 23rd lines. And, if the territorial issue could be addressed, that ultimately this could end in a negotiated settlement. The president has spoken about a negotiated settlement. So there is an alternative way out there, I think, for Vladimir Putin. The problem is that, of course, he's displayed very little interest in taking the steps that would be needed for that. We think he still hasn't fundamentally changed his position on Ukraine. But we, I think, are trying to manage the escalation risk in that way. It's not going to stop us from supporting Ukraine. It's not going to stop us from helping Ukraine defend itself and get its country back.
So along those lines, given all of this and given the way Putin has really used the threat of the use of nuclear weapons to enable his invasion of Ukraine, can we ever get back to business as usual with Russia? Is there a way to work with Putin, or do we have to wait for him to be replaced?
Well, I would just say I don't think he's been able to use nuclear weapons to advance his invasion of Ukraine. I don't think we've been deterred from sending things because of a nuclear threat. I mean, we've sent enormous amounts of military security assistance as well as economic assistance. I think there has been a framework around some of that assistance, which is based on the president's guidance about wanting to avoid a direct conflict between the United States and Russia and limit the war to Ukraine. So I think that there has been a bit of a framework there, but that's separate, I think, to the nuclear piece. So I don't see that nuclear coercion has worked or been effective. And just on the matter of can we get back to business as usual, look, I think we need to be realistic. We've seen major sort of active aggression by Vladimir Putin, by Russia against the people of Ukraine. We can't just forget that or move past that. I think that is something that we will be grappling with and dealing with for some time. And those responsible, I think, will be held to account for that and are in many ways being held to account for that by the strength of the international response. But we have also been clear all along that we will continue to work with or to talk with Russia if there are vital sort of shared problems or interests, including managing nuclear risk. And we have been communicating with them through various channels over the last several months to make sure that they're aware of our position on matters, including nuclear escalation. So we are not closing the door on working with the Russian government in the future. We are very clear, though, that the war must end, that they must cease their aggression, and that we need to secure a Ukraine that's free and independent, again, with the ability to defend itself in the future. So that's our priority.
So speaking about shared interests with countries that we might not always see eye to eye with, the report does identify climate change as a fundamental strategic challenge. How does the US plan to get China to cooperate on climate issues while it's also seen as an adversary?
Yeah, but again, we've been pretty clear on this. I think that we are willing, and we say in the strategy that we are willing to work with China on shared interests and that we will not allow geopolitical competition to be a barrier to that. So if we're competing with China, we're not going to break off attempts or dialogues on cooperation on climate or on pandemics or on the global economy or anything else. Unfortunately, Beijing has actually taken the opposite position. They have said that they will only cooperate on issues like climate if there are concessions in the geopolitical arena. They broke off the dialogue on climate change following the speaker's visit to Taiwan in August of this year. We think that that was very irresponsible. That hurts not just the United States, but the people of the world, and especially those countries for whom climate change is a particularly existential risk. And so our view is that we need to separate these out, compartmentalize them. And so we would have cooperation on these issues alongside competition. I would say that we also recognize that we need to be realistic about the levels of cooperation that we can secure with countries that we are competing with. We can't just count on those channels or on those mechanisms of cooperation. We also have to have a second track where we deepen our cooperation with like-minded countries, particularly democracies, across a wide array of issues, but including climate change and global public health. And the final thing I'd say is that while competition in a lot of ways, I think, complicates cooperation, there's also some opportunity there. You know, we should be using some of these impulses of competition, particularly when it comes to clean technology, to make those domestic investments to ensure that what we see is sort of a race to the top rather than a race to the bottom. I mean, there is a way, I think, of harnessing competitive impulses to advance efforts on these shared challenges, including climate.
Well, Tom, thanks so much. We could have talked a lot more about a lot more issues, but just really thank you for taking the time.
Thanks so much, Emma. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Lowen Billett, Angela Kellett, and Alex Hall. Audio engineering in San Francisco by Jacqueline Shing. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit ploughshares.org.